Okay, well, hello and welcome to everyone in the room. Thank you for making time to be here today. I've just pressed the record button, and assuming no technical glitches, the recording that's being made will be available to access in a few days' time. So please be aware, whatever is said is being recorded. Now, this event hopefully represents or is the first of several such events. So we intend soon to finalise and advertise 2 events in November that are provisionally titled Philosophy and Nursing, Where Are We Now? And Philosophy and Nursing the Next 10 Years. These November happenings will launch the book just published titled The Routledge Handbook of Philosophy and Nursing. And at each event we plan to bring together a range of speakers to get a range of views. Thereafter, in January next year, we have an event that critically unpacks and addresses the interesting but problematic nature of pain and patient reports of pain, a critique of the way in which Margot McCaffrey's work's employed in nursing. So that's what's in the pipeline. And now to today. My name is Martin Lipscomb, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Traynor. Michael was, until recently, until April, Professor of Nursing at Middlesex University in the UK. He is now retired, but continuing to think and write. Michael has become an independent scholar. Michael's work, his outputs are available to view at michael-traynor.net. And if anyone's unfamiliar with his work, I'd heartily recommend a visit to his site. A founding member of the Centre for Critical Research in Nursing and Midwifery. Over his career, Michael's work has been consistently interesting, provocative, challenging, and readable. He has authored books dealing with health policy, sociology, managerialism, research, and resilience. His papers, which are far too numerous to list, cover a broad suite of topics relevant to nursing and healthcare, and his website notes his interest in discourse analysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Today, Michael will be talking to a paper published in 2022 in Nursing Philosophy titled Empathy, Caring and Compassion Towards a Freudian Critique of Nursing Work. I'll let Michael introduce and explain his paper himself in a minute. He'll do a far better job than I can at that. And when Michael's finished, we'll take questions. I'll explain how we'll manage that later. But before handing over to Michael, I'd just like to say the work being discussed is rather good indeed. The paper is interesting for a number of reasons. Whether or not they're accepted, the arguments that Michael presents are worthy of attention. They deserve consideration. And as with so much of his work, this form of critique, this form of scholarship, occupies a fascinating place in nurse writing. How we, I think, collectively deal with or respond to arguments of the sort that Michael presents will tell us a lot, I think, about the nature of our profession, its strengths and its weaknesses. Anyway, without further ado, Michael, please, would you describe your excellent paper? What is empathy, caring and compassion towards a Freudian critique of nursing work all about?
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for inviting me. I'm flattered and pleased that I've really tried to slice this paper into something that I can fit into half an hour, as Martin was keen to have discussion after. So I'm going to have to rattle through it, which doesn't feel comfortable. I'd far sooner that there were time to kind of light a cigarette between every kind of paragraph and pause, but there isn't. So I'm sorry, I'm going to sort of just go for it. But hopefully in 29 minutes time, we'll have a time to just to talk in a slightly more relaxed way, slightly less manic, right? So I wanted to start by saying my motivation for probably all of my kind of personal research work in nursing has been a frustration that ideas circulate in nursing that are widely promoted and celebrated, but that actually don't stand up to much critical scrutiny. And they can be ideas that lead the profession down paths to places that actually aren't very helpful. And often the circulation of these ideas serves a purpose for particular groups, but it's not necessarily the purpose that's kind of stated. One key cherished idea is that nursing work is based around the nurse's empathy, caring and compassion towards patients or clients, and that this makes it highly valuable and some might say unique activity and occupation. As a taster of what's to come, here's a quotation from Freud writing about religion, and he said, Thus, we call a belief an illusion when a wish fulfillment is a prominent factor in its motivation. And in doing so, we disregard its relations to reality, just as the illusion itself sets no store by verification. A few years back, I started a project to explore what the tradition embodied by three thinkers who've been called the masters of suspicion might make of some of these cherished ideas. So here's a little bit about the hermeneutics of suspicion. It was Paul Ricoeur that's credited with describing three European thinkers as the masters of suspicion. And if you don't know who they were Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud, who was a neurologist, but the founder of psychoanalysis. Ricoeur thought that these people shaped the intellectual mood of the 20th century, and that according to him, each of them, he says, sought to unmask, demystify, and expose the real from the apparent, not only by means of a destructive critique, but by the invention of an art of interpreting. So each of them, of these thinkers, exposed what we might call a false consciousness, and their ideas have pulled the rug out from under many of Western culture's comforting beliefs. Probably most importantly, though, their work has given rise to a broad and fertile range of critical theoretical studies that include work in literary studies, cultural theory, anthropology, legal studies, political science, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. But talking of psychoanalysis, I want to maybe avoid any sort of misunderstanding at the outset. What I've written here, I'm not sure about. I said I'd like to approach psychoanalysis as a cultural hermeneutic practice rather than a therapeutic practice, therapeutic in the sense of wanting to make people feel better. So I'd kind of say that. But actually the truth claims of psychoanalysis, of certainly Freud's claims, are actually claims that are based in the clinic. But the realm of analysis of psychoanalysis has moved far from the clinic, as even Freud's essays, his essay on religion, which is The Future of an Illusion, published in 1927, that's the earlier quote was from there, and about culture, his book Civilization and Its Discontents from 1930. So they show even then the range of psychoanalysis was way beyond the clinic. So talking of Western culture's comforting beliefs, what would the hermeneutic of suspicion look like when applied to our profession of nursing? What would those comforting certainties and beliefs might be? And I think, so that leads me to ask these two key questions. So in this talk, I'm trying to apply certain bits of psychoanalytic theory, or at least my understanding of them, to these two questions. Question number one, why is there ambiguity about who is the nurse and who is the patient? And secondly, why do nurses repeat complaints about their desire to care being blocked? So caring and compassion and empathy are repeated in professionalizing literature as nurses' vital characteristic. So Nightingale is often presented as a model of compassion, though actually, I think she was far more concerned with efficiency. Benner and Rubel in 1989 wrote The Primacy of Caring, and Patterson and Sderad in 1976 saw caring as connecting nurses and nursing with this grand project of developing human potential. And there are other kind of little phrases and ideas in this kind of vein. So people say, doctors cure, nurses care. People talk about the art of caring set against a managerialist counting the countable, but missing the essence. And values-based recruitment, certainly here in the UK, is an expression of that. It's emerged in recent years. So understanding caring and compassion as what Roland Barthes calls second-order signifiers allows us to interpret them as signifying a value that is fundamental to nursing's professional identity and ideology. Okay. So that's a super quick background about caring and its promotion in nursing. I now want to introduce two sort of key theories from Freud, theories that he spent a whole kind of career working on and developing and writing about, that I'm sort of condensing into two short paragraphs. Okay. So the first theory concerns the proposal and the elaboration of the notion of the unconscious. So the unconscious, Freud argued, is a result of the continual repression of thoughts, ideas, and memories, often from childhood, that are too difficult or traumatic to process consciously. These disappear from the conscious mind, but continue to be active and can reappear in consciousness in certain circumstances. In other words, we are unaware of them, yet they influence our thoughts, emotions, and behavior in apparently irrational and possibly destructive ways. So you might say these repressions give rise to symptoms. The work of the unconscious might be glimpsed through dreams, jokes, and slips of the tongue that Freud called parapraxis. So Freud set out various topologies of the psyche, and one being the division into, this is familiar, into id, ego, and superego. So the id, like literally in English, it just means the it, is the entirely unconscious region of the psyche that operates on the so-called pleasure principle and is the source of impulses and drives seeking immediate pleasure and gratification. The ego describes a broadly rational part of the psyche constrained by the principle of reality and struggling to control or modify the powerful and, in developmental terms, the primitive drives of the id. The third part he labeled the superego, harshly critical, full of moral and societal imperatives, using guilt, anxiety, and a sense of inferiority as its modus operandi. I love it. I love it. So familiar. Freud's model sees the ego as resorting to various forms of defenses when dealing with the demands of the id. And these include denial, fantasy, and regression. And there are others. Freud describes the ego as nicht Herr im eigenen Haus. In other words, not being master in its own house. So the human psyche as a divided site of continually unresolved yet hidden conflicting interests is a starkly different picture to the rational and unified self of the Enlightenment. So the second theory I want to introduce is the proposal of the death drive. So this came late in Freud's work, around 1920. So he developed this aspect of his theory after years of observing that individuals appear to compulsively repeat painful or traumatic but familiar experiences. He noted this among his patients and others, such as the so-called shell-shocked First World War veterans, or his grandson, I don't know whether you've read this, playing this game, Fort Da, which means gone there. And the game involved repeatedly throwing a toy, I think most characteristically a bobbin on a string, out of sight, and then pulling it back again. And then he'd say da, or a sound that sounded like da. And Freud argued that this is restaging the distressing disappearance of his mother. There's lots more to say about this. So such observations led Freud to propose an alternative, opposing and in some ways more fundamental drive to libido, which was his idea of a kind of basic life drive. And when elaborating the death drive, he looked to both biology and to what you might call cosmic forces for an explanation. So biologically, he proposed a mechanism of the kind of neutralization of drive excitation within the human mental apparatus. So an attempt always to kind of return to a kind of homeostasis. And cosmically, you might say, that's not his word, it's mine and others. He understood the death drive as an urge in organic life to restore an earlier state of things, which is the inorganic state from which life originally emerged, hence the death in death drive. Now, subsequent thinkers working in Freud's tradition have generally rejected these foundations for understanding the death drive. So French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who briefly brought structural linguistics to bear on Freud's thinking, identified the death drive with an automatism that brings with it a certain enjoyment or satisfaction. So he proposed that the drive satisfies itself by missing its object of desire. So in diagrammatic terms, by looping around it and returning empty-handed, rather than by obtaining it. Another person, Slavoj Žižek, who's, again, if you don't know, Slovenian Marxist psychoanalyst and cultural theorist. So he developed these ideas further, and he proposed that the drive's true aim, which is masked, is to maintain the circular motion of repeatedly missing its object. And the purpose of the drive in his model is just simply to keep repeating. So one helpful outcome of this continual failure in psychic terms is that the unattained lost object can be given and retain a heightened and even transcendental value. And I'd argue that the expression of empathy within managerialist health systems might be considered as such an object for nurses. And I'll return to that later. Now, at this point in the paper, I kind of rehearsed some of the critiques of Freud's whole project, and there are a great many. But I don't have the time to do that here. Right, now I'm going to try and address those two questions. So the first one being, who is the patient and who is the nurse? So one starting point for speculation about what Freud might have said about empathy, caring, and compassion in nursing is to consider Isabel Menzies-Lith's classic study on social defenses against anxiety among nurses, published in 1959 and 1960. So she was a psychoanalyst working at London's Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, a centre that specialised in studies of organisations. And she was asked for help with a hospital's problem. And we're told the senior staff felt that there was a danger of complete breakdown in the system of allocating student nurses to frontline work with patients, while also trying to train them effectively. Sound familiar? So Menzies-Lith, following Freud's hermeneutic approach, took this as a presenting problem, masking a deeper psychic cause, about to look for its origins. So her method, also like Freud, involved extensive talking with people. So Menzies-Lith claimed that one of the ways that the organization of work in the hospital was meant to reduce anxiety, but appeared to fail, was through various working arrangements for distancing nurses from patients by fragmenting the patient into a series of task-based encounters. In the process, this attempt to evade anxiety thwarted any opportunity to gain satisfaction from exercising caring and compassion, which the nurses involved in the study said that they wished to do. Menzies-Lith believed that the same process that depersonalized the patient also depersonalized the nurse or the students. So the students, like the patients, were treated as categories, such as a second year. And these categories associated them with an agglomeration of expected skills. She believed that the expression of any individuality in the work was discouraged, as was the development of close relationships with patients. She says that this work was done not out of interest for the welfare of individual nurses, but to avoid the spread of distress among the students and so stave off workforce instability. So Menzies-Lith described the deep ambivalence that caring evoked for the nurses, and particularly the students, using Freud's description of infantile psychic life, which was developed by Melanie Klein. She proposed that the distress that the nurses experienced was connected to infantile anxieties aroused in the nurse by contact with seriously ill patients. She suggested that the nurse projects her own infantile fantasy into the workplace, experiencing the work as a deeply painful mixture of objective reality and fantasy. Because student nurses had expected the hospital to be an environment in which they could find their own dependence supported, she believed that they found the lack of personal care that they encountered particularly painful. So their witness to and involvement in caregiving to patients gave rise to a degree of jealousy and other strongly ambivalent feelings towards the patient. In other words, Menzies-Lith claimed that the students identified with the patients because they craved and perhaps expected to be recipients of care, because as neophytes, they shared vulnerability with the patients. The organization's defense against the resulting anxiety was essentially one of evasion, and this unsuccessful attempt blocked the possibility for individual nurses to be helped to confront such anxiety and learn to deal with it more effectively. And without this, the empathy and caring that's idealized within the profession remains deeply ambivalent at a personal level. Okay. Question 2. Why do nurses repeat complaints about their desire to care being blocked? So earlier I mentioned that the presentation of empathy, caring, and compassion in nursing and nursing texts and talk very often comes coupled with the threat of their opposite that's always in danger of overwhelming and blocking their expression by nurses. So in ideological terms, this has the effect of keeping the promise of its value always alive. In psychoanalytic terms, the repetition of failure, that is to be properly empathetic, alerts us to the operation of the death drive. Let me try and develop this a little. So one place where we might find this repetition is in the words of nurses, and another is in the field of research on caring. So why might this expression be so often coupled with statements about moral distress and the impossibility of caring in the words of nurses? Well, as Menzies-Lith points out, nurses face heavy demands for pity, compassion, and sympathy, yet may find the tasks of nursing disturbing and particular patients difficult. This arouses, she goes on to suggest, guilt and anxiety because such feelings, disgust in patients and others, are not believed to be worthy of the profession. There's also something idealized about the character of the empathy, caring, and compassion that nurses identify with, such that they can never match up to the ideal. As a result of the guilt and shame that this causes, nurses project this failure onto the outside in the form of the organization that they work in, or onto colleagues, preventing their expression. Not only does the organization and its management constrain the expression of these qualities and ideals while simultaneously appearing to demand them, it fails to care for nurses themselves in the midst of their own stressful and highly demanding work. So such complaints have been voiced repeatedly over many decades by nurses, and certainly in the research that I've been involved in. And when you listen to these complaints, perhaps in focus groups or interviews or in the staff room, it's hard, I think, not to notice some kind of enjoyment and satisfaction in their repetition. But this isn't to discount these complaints. The complaints, I think, are justifiable. The second repetition can be found in the nature of research by nurses into caring. And I found this repetition in John Paley's paper, published in 2001, An Archaeology of Caring Knowledge. In nursing's long-standing preoccupation with caring, I think Paley has noticed the same blocked progress. So he examines a number of nursing texts which claim to investigate and try to understand the nature of caring. He points out a potentially endless repetition of thesaurus-like terms that many of their authors describe as an analysis. So he says researchers in caring have produced extensive heterogeneous lists of what their research participants, who are nurses, have said about caring. Paley says a lot, but he uses the terms in this paper, endlessness and uselessness, regarding this whole project. So there's a circularity in the use of these signifiers of caring that appears to lack an exit point in this field of writing. From a Freudian point of view, repetition can be seen as a sign of the death drive in operation. Freud understood the compulsion to repeat as designed unconsciously to achieve certain ends. That is, an attempt to experience some control over a traumatic stimulus retrospectively. So looking at the fort-da game of the baby, we could argue that the repetition of disappearance followed by reappearance turns for the child a trauma. And just to be clear, psychoanalysts, what they mean by trauma is unnameable and unmanageable. So to turn a trauma into an experience of loss, which is something able to be symbolized and hence no longer traumatic. So we could argue that nurses make a similar attempt to name the trauma inherent in nursing work, that is, terrible experiences they have without being properly supported, by repeating complaints about managers or other workers. In other words, assertions of powerlessness. So whether this attempt to symbolize the traumatic is successful, in inverted commas, seems uncertain. So Lacan likens the death drive to automatism because it refers to a human tendency to repeatedly derail our own intentions, to be caught in a loop of repetition that brings a kind of satisfaction, but not the satisfaction of achieving ends or achieving the aimed at pleasure, but of the repetition of the failure to do so. And Zizek writes of the death drive as leading not to annihilation, as its name might suggest, but to the realm of the undead, a zombie-like existence characterized by guilt and pain, where actions are repeated long after they have any life or meaning. Okay, so this last section, so what for the profession? This section has got bigger and now it's got kind of smaller. So these approaches propose insight that I've just outlined, propose insights into puzzling or apparently contradictory observations about nursing, such as the repetition of complaints about organizational constraints on care. The profession or organizations may rely on these phenomena or these dysfunctions for their continued functioning. And individuals may rely on these defenses for their own continued functioning. In other words, the symptoms that Freud and later Menzies-Lift detect always serve a purpose by protecting the individual or the organization from becoming aware of a profoundly disturbing problem. Nevertheless, psychoanalytic work in the clinic is ultimately aimed at pointing the way to freedom from what can be painful and self-destructive symptoms. But arriving at that point, even arriving in the in the clinic, even arriving on the couch, involves a disquieting journey where comforting certainties about ourselves and the value and meaning of what we do are profoundly questioned. So that's the end. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Michael. I really would recommend the paper to anyone who hasn't read it. I've put the DOI number up in the chat. Okay, we'll now take questions. So please either pop your question into the chat box, or alternatively, there's a little button at the bottom of the screen, slightly to the right, where you can raise a virtual hand. Now, I've just been having a moment of panic as to whether I could then unmute you so you can ask your question. But if you raise your hand, I will try and unmute you. But just one thing, it's quite easy to miss one of these virtual hands being raised, or I might miss your question in the chat box. We'll see. So if I do that, please just do it again, and I'll try and grab that thing. Now, while questions are being composed, I'll abuse my power as convener to ask a question of my own. Michael, I'd like to ask you about the type of knowledge created, supplied, or associated with psychoanalysis. In your view, epistemologically, what sort of knowledge claim do psychoanalytic thinkers make or offer? You do trifle with this on page 2 of the paper, and the short circuit idea that you propose is interesting, but could you say more?
Yeah. Okay. I left that short circuit bit out of this paper. The first thing, Martin, is that all psychoanalysts, or different schools and branches, they're all different, so that I would suggest they all make different claims. And Freud perhaps was unusual, but okay, but being somebody from his sort of era, from his point in history, actually, like Marx, actually, okay, let me say it first. My inclination would have been to say, oh, it's a kind of cultural product. It's the kind of knowledge that you're free to sort of consider and to drop. But actually, Freud was uncompromising that psychoanalysis was a clinical science, and it was based on thorough and lengthy observation in his sessions of analysis, and the constant refuting of hypotheses that he might be developing that didn't fit in with observation in the clinical sessions. So he distanced his work from this idea of Weltanschauung, of a worldview where you just fit knowledge into it, and he saw his work as definitely a Naturwissenschaften, natural science. He insisted on that. But when he reached the limits of science, he says, he moved on to speculation. But when he does that in his writing, he's very clear to say this is speculation. So he was very clear to say his claims were a natural science based on observation and refuting of hypotheses. But psychoanalysis isn't one thing, as I mentioned. So Lacan, for example, would probably have a very different approach to that kind of question.
Yes. Well, let me just follow on from that then. The use value of this type of critique in nursing is a challenging paper, because you move through a number of discourses, a number of ideas which don't often receive attention in nursing, and therefore it's certainly not parochial. You're inviting ideas in from outside. That can be difficult, can't it, for any discipline to make sense of and accept. So when I was saying epistemologically, it can be difficult, can't it, to understand the views, the opinions that are coming in from what are sometimes thought of as alien disciplines. That's not really a question, it's a comment, but would you respond?
Well, I don't know. Okay, this isn't much of a response, but I wonder whether a lot of this is personal temperament, because some of us love that, and maybe for other people it's kind of uncomfortable and problematic. But I suppose it depends where your orientation really is. I mean, if your horizon is very clearly kind of, this is nursing has great value, what can I draw from the disciplines around me to help a nursing project? That's one stance. Or it could be that my orientation is a sociological one. I'm interested in the professions, and so looking at nursing is you're sort of looking at it from outside the profession. So you're using nursing as an example to understand some other kind of phenomenon. So that those seem to be two different stances that people can take. Oh, we've got a Roger says, doesn't it use? Yes, but isn't that the thing, Roger, about it uses? So what do you mean by using them? If it's using them to develop, with the intention of developing a body of nursing knowledge, or that's one thing, but so that would be the first category that I was talking about. But there is another way to be doing this kind of work.
If anyone has raised their electronic hands, unfortunately, I can't see them going up. So if you could refer me to that in the chat box, then I'd be able to pick that up. It could be a fault at my end. Does anyone else have a comment or a question they'd like to add to the chat box, or raise your hand? Michael,
I'm reading the questions there. Yeah. Rachel says, when you talk about traumatic stimulus, you return to the individual. Do you think the traumatic stimulus may be that nursing has created ideals, such as compassion, but these ideals may not work with the work and communication that nurses actually have to engage in? Yes, I mean, I find attention in thinking about this kind of stuff because psychoanalysts tell you they really emphasize singularity of people, so that the same experience might be unpleasant for one person but traumatic for another person. So I think you've got to consider that people respond to things in different ways, and sometimes a trauma you only feel it retrospectively when something else happens, and then you're traumatized by some event. So you could say that nursing exposes the workforce to certain things like idealized pictures of compassion, and also the same kind of horror, if you like. But people can respond to it in different ways because people are singular. How would Freud suggest these sorts of problems can be overcome? That is a risk for all ideals, not just compassion. I'm losing track now. How can they be overcome? Well, okay, this is a sort of sidestepping type answer, but I think it's a valid one. Is it thinking of the three masters of suspicion here? The more kind of radical the critique, the more radical if you were thinking in terms of solution, has to be. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I mean, clearly Menzies Lith worked for an organization that charged whoever they worked for money to make things better for them. So clearly there is a tradition of using these kind of psychodynamic analysis to help organizations do things better. But there's lots of kind of there's going to be resistance to that, because when something is from one angle dysfunctional, it must be serving a purpose for somebody, otherwise it wouldn't continue. So that's my garbled response to that. Okay. I'm a PhD student and novice learner in this field. I spoke to an emergency department network director yesterday, and she was grappling with how to promote nurses to change practices and take up best practices. Does this speak to a lack of care for our nurses and self-destructive symptoms? Well, okay, because this is a talk that's meant to be about kind of psychoanalytic thinking. That's I try and approach these questions from that kind of angle. I don't know. I think there are other kind of ways that you'd come at this problem. I mean, there's always a reward for not taking up evidence-based practice, if that's what this question is about. There's always a reward for not doing it at a sort of organizational level, as well as probably an individual level. Whether they're to do with the unconscious, I don't know, but yeah, there is something about repetition. This is, we just keep doing something, even though we sort of kind of know that it's not working. Nevertheless, we're going to keep doing it because it's familiar.
Michael, let me come in on Andrea's comment and also Roger's. Roger talks about how can these problems overcome. Andrea is referring to real world change. The value of the type of paper that you've written for me is the ideas that you present and the challenge to existing ways of thinking. So having read your paper, it's very difficult to listen to conversations about care and compassion without having it at the back of your mind. But it doesn't lend itself it doesn't have a use value in the way that many nursing publications do. And before we kicked off, we were talking a little bit about the Frankfurt School that you do refer to in the paper, and the value of the work of those critical theorists was to challenge existing ways of thinking without necessarily telling us what we should do as a result. And your paper, for me, fits into that that genre where you disturb thinking around something which we talk about all the time, care and compassion, but you're not offering solutions, are you?
No, I no. I mean, no. Clearly, I'm not. But once it seems to me that, say something like the unconscious, once you've kind of acknowledged or take seriously that humans have got a tendency to kind of act irrationally, sabotage their own best intentions, and that somehow this might get played out in an organization or a group. Once you've kind of taken that on board and take it seriously, then if you are proposing, if you're looking at what appears to be a problem in an organization or a profession or something, you realize that solutions that are sort of purely kind of based on kind of assuming that everybody's a rational actor and will, respond to certain kind of rewards or whatever, you realize that can only go so far, I suppose. So that's the contribution that these types of critique make.
Yes. Does anybody else have any comments or questions that they'd like to throw at Michael? If so, do pop something into the chat or do the hand raising thing. Okay.
Change the unconscious. I don't think so. I think the unconscious is unconscious, and the forces are unconscious. So I don't, if you'd like to think of kind of the human psyche as basically it's under rational control, I think, well, I'm sure plenty of individuals and thinkers kind of believe that, but that is, that's the kind of project of psychoanalysis, to suggest actually it's not, we're not kind of this kind of unified kind of rational individual as a human. That's just doesn't describe things. And yes. Knocking rationality of the Enlightenment, it's just, they're limited. I mean, rationality and the Enlightenment, they're kind of, limited. You might even say kind of misguided. There's plenty of kind of strong critiques of that view of kind of humanity. Freya says, I appreciate your work in using theory to explore nursing as a kind of social example. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the role of fantasy in nursing. I've been interested in Todd McGowan's recent work on the role of fantasy in racism, but I must admit I'm quite new to psychoanalysis as a theoretical framework. I do listen to Todd McGowan's podcasts. I think they're great. I remember him, the one about when he was he going to buy a new car, but in the end he decided he'd stick with his old one. Freya, maybe you could say something much more interesting than I could if you're willing and you're technically able to say something. Is that possible?
Freya, would you like me to try and unmute you using the button pressing powers that I have? Let me just try and...
Oh, hello.
You have the power of speech, Freya.
Yeah, fantastic.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm listening whilst also trying to cook some food, so apologies if you can hear that in the background. Yeah, no, I really appreciated your talk and what you're doing. It's a real interest of mine about how we can use theory to consider nursing in sort of new or different ways. But yeah, the concept of fantasy in psychoanalysis is something that I'm interested to understand more about. Yeah, I totally agree. The podcast is a really good one, Why Theory, if people haven't looked that up already. And they do a good job of sort of distilling down some of these terms. But yeah, I wondered in what ways you think fantasy might be sort of perpetuating the kind of status quo of how nursing operates. If indeed it is, I just wondered what your take on that was.
Do you know something? I mean, I could sort of stammer out some kind of an answer, but I'm really more interested in you talking about the question, actually.
Okay. Well,
like why that particular, so you must think there's something interesting about fantasy and nursing work.
Well, I suppose I was struck by what you were saying about actually how the kind of what I might see as like sort of I don't know what the language would be, but sort of defense mechanisms almost of those repetitions of those kind of grievances and such like. That's very familiar to me. I can completely relate. But I suppose I'm thinking, actually, how does the gap between reality and what we imagine nursing might be, how does that actually serve some kind of function for us? Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of wondering to what extent there might be some kind of enjoyment in that in some way, almost like not having to really come to terms with reality or but again, I might be confusing lots of different terms here. I know terms mean different things in different theoretical schools.
Yes, I mean, Menzies seemed to be saying that the nurses experience, their work, the workplace, with this mixture of kind of fantasy and reality. But if I was more kind of familiar with the area, I'd probably have an answer, but I'm afraid I'd just be just stammering something. So, but I'll look it up. That's really interesting, and I must listen to more of their podcasts. So, okay, Darlene says, sorry, Roger, I'm skipping over your question, if that's okay. Darlene, most nurses and the public have a difficult time replacing and/or critiquing the importance of caring in healthcare. We have many attempts at promoting better caring and requiring this, values-based screening, etc. I'm participating in a project that exploring the usefulness of covenant of care to reframe ethics and responsibility. We're exploring whether framing the relationship between society and nursing as a covenant rather than a contract and transactional could open up mutuality in the commitment to care. Both nurse and society share responsibility with different roles in that covenant, but some suggest covenant requires a transcendence. You used a quote around transcendence. Beyond a god or deity, what might this transcendence be? Well, okay, so the first thing is to say, I believe that this sort of psychoanalytic analysis is powerful and useful in certain ways. But it doesn't mean that other approaches, other projects, like obviously what you're involved in, isn't helpful. It doesn't mean it's all since psychoanalysis, everything is now kind of flawed and discovered as being bogus. That's not. I don't think that's useful. So clearly, caring is some kind of overarching quality that you want to have happening in a healthcare system. Of course it is, and if there's ways of thinking about that and thinking carefully about it, helping people to overcome barriers to behave in caring ways, and then absolutely fine. I mean, it's transcendence. Surely it's not a matter of transcendence, isn't it? Just a matter of kind of shared objectives between, shared sort of values between in a community. I mean, that's Richard Rorty's kind of line, isn't it? It's kind of you don't need to have sky hooks. It's all about kind of shared values and shared understandings.
Esther, if you want to unmute, then you now have the power of speech.
That's good then. No, all I was going to say, I was just listening to what you were saying. So I can't remember loads about Freud because I did him rather a long time ago, badly in psychology A level. But what I was thinking about was that nursing quite often is associated with trauma, either through major issues like wars or pandemics, or people's personal trauma in the fact that they've landed up in a hospital. And most of the time, it's the hotel people don't want to be in, to be honest. So I would say it's probably more related to trauma, in my experience, than anything else.
What the profession, nursing, is
it's a response. It's always associated with a trauma, whether it's the nurses because they've had to go through a very acute medical scenario or a surgical scenario, in that it's very acute, it's very abrupt, it's very sudden, and they have to deal with it. Or it's the person's own trauma in the fact that they are somewhere they never expected they would ever be, or they've had a major life event thrust on them that they never even saw coming.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm writing about resilience, and I keep coming back, and I was thinking it's just me, but I keep coming back to thinking nursing, trauma. They're just
no, right up against. I think they go hand in hand, just in different genres. To be fair.
Yeah.
Like I worked with heart attack patients for a long time, and that's very traumatic, obviously, for the person and the family, especially if there's a sudden death. Or you can have somebody that's at palliation at the end of life that may never have accepted it, and therefore that's very traumatic for them as well. So for me, I would say it's got a hand in hand with trauma.
Yes.
Whatever way you look at it.
Yeah.
And then war again, nursing and war grew up together. But in the modern thinking, if you look at it from Florence Nightingale, all the way down the track, it's been associated with wartime and the military and stuff. And also COVID was probably no different if you think about it from that point of view. That's probably essentially a war, but against an illness, not an aggressor in that sense.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's interesting. It's a really interesting thing to think about. But that, for me personally, I would say it's more trauma related than anything else.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah. No, that's
about Freud anymore, though. I remember the ego and the id, and that was about it.
Oh, so you've forgotten the super ego. So that's interesting.
I forgot that bit. I remember the ego and the id, and I forgot that bit. I think that's because I was really bad at doing psychology A level.
Well, I think there's another explanation for why you've forgotten the super ego. I love the super ego. It's just, you read that short description, I can't remember where I got it from, and it just feels so kind of familiar. Don't know about anybody else.
Okay. Shall we just wrap it up, and because it is useful, I think, to end on time, so those who need to get to work in America and elsewhere can do so. Michael, thank you very much for talking to your work today. If anyone hasn't read the paper, Empathy, Caring, Compassion, I really would recommend it. It is a very challenging paper, and it's a disturbing paper in some senses, and it's one that it's an argument that will stay with you. So, Michael, thank you very much for doing this today. Thank you for everyone who made time to be here, and thank you one and all.
Thanks, Martin, for organising this. It's brilliant.
Cool. All right. Goodbye, everybody.